You smell it before you see it. The sweet, cloying stench of death mingles with frankincense in the royal chambers of Santa Fe, that temporary city built outside Granada's walls. The year is 1491, and you are the court physician to Isabella I of Castile, the most powerful woman in Christendom. Your leather bag rattles with useless remedies as you approach the Queen's tent, but nothing in your arsenal can combat what you're about to discover. Through the silk pavilion's entrance, you see her kneeling in prayer, still wearing that same white linen shift she donned 3 months ago when the siege began. The fabric, once pure as fresh snow, now bears a constellation of stains, yellow sweat marks, brown blood from her self-flagellation, and darker patches you dare not contemplate. But it's the movement in those stained folds that stops your breath cold. Fleas, hundreds of them, living and breeding in the accumulated filth of Spain's queen. This is not a story about medieval hygiene. This is a story about how one woman's religious fanaticism created the perfect biological weapon, her own body, and how that weapon came perilously close to destroying the Spanish kingdom from within. Because those fleas crawling across Isabella's unwashed undergarments weren't just parasites, they were plague carriers, and they were about to turn the Spanish court into a charnel house. The first victim was a young page named Diego, barely 14 years old. He had helped Isabella adjust her cloak after morning prayers, his small hands briefly touching the Queen's shoulders where the fabric of her shift was visible. Within hours, tiny red welts appeared on his arms, flea bites that would seal his fate. 3 days later, Diego was dead, his lymph nodes swollen to the size of eggs, his body covered in the dark spots that gave the Black Death its name. But Diego was just the beginning. What you're about to hear is the documented account of how Queen Isabella's sacred vow nearly accomplished what 7 centuries of Islamic resistance could not: the complete destruction of Christian Spain. To understand how Isabella's undergarments became instruments of mass death, we must travel back to the Cathedral of Córdoba, April 1491. Picture the scene. Isabella kneels before the massive altar, surrounded by the most powerful nobles in Spain. Ferdinand, her husband, stands beside her, his face grim with the weight of impending war. This is to be the final siege of the Reconquista. Granada, the last Muslim stronghold, must fall. But Isabella doesn't see this as merely a military campaign. To her, this is the ultimate spiritual test, a holy war that demands the ultimate sacrifice. And so, before God and her assembled court, she makes a vow that will echo through history. She will not change her linen undergarments until Granada falls to Christian forces. The nobles murmur their approval. Such dedication, such piety, they have no idea they are witnessing the birth of a biological catastrophe. Medieval undergarments were not simple affairs. Isabella's shift was a complex construction of multiple layers of linen, designed to absorb the body's secretions while providing modesty and warmth. In normal circumstances, such garments would be changed weekly, washed with harsh lye soap, and thoroughly aired. But Isabella's vow transformed her clothing into something far more sinister, a breeding ground for the deadliest disease known to medieval Europe. The siege of Granada was expected to last months, and Isabella prepared accordingly. She established her court in Santa Fe, that newly constructed city of tents and temporary buildings just outside Granada's walls. Here, surrounded by thousands of soldiers, servants, and courtiers, she would maintain her vigil. Here, her unwashed body would become a ticking biological bomb. As spring turned to summer, the Spanish heat became merciless. Temperatures soared above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, turning Isabella's tent into a furnace. The Queen's body, wrapped in layers of increasingly filthy linen, became a perfect incubator for bacteria, fungi, and parasites. Her shift, once white, darkened to yellow, then brown, then black with accumulated grime. But it was the fleas that turned discomfort into disaster. Medieval Spain was already riddled with fleas. They lived in every castle, every hovel, every stable. But Isabella's unwashed body offered them something extraordinary, a permanent, mobile feast that traveled throughout the highest levels of Spanish society. The irony was perfect and terrible. Isabella's extreme uncleanliness was rooted in the most devout Christian theology of her time. To the medieval mind, bathing was not just unnecessary, it was spiritually dangerous, a practice associated with Islam, Judaism, and paganism. The truly holy, church authorities taught, should smell like martyrs, of blood, sweat, and sacred suffering. This belief system had disastrous consequences during Isabella's siege. While Islamic Granada maintained sophisticated bathhouses and strict cleanliness rituals, the Christian army outside its walls actively embraced filth as a sign of divine favor. Isabella, as their spiritual leader, took this philosophy to its deadly extreme. The Queen's personal physician, a learned man named Rodrigo Maldonado, was the first to notice the pattern. It began with the servants who attended Isabella most closely, her dressers, her food tasters, her prayer companions. One by one they fell ill with symptoms he recognized from previous plague outbreaks: fever, chills, and the telltale buboes that swelled like black fruit under their arms and in their groins. But Maldonado made a crucial error. He assumed the plague was spreading from the army camps where thousands of soldiers lived in squalid conditions. He never suspected that the source of the contagion was the Queen herself, kneeling in her private chapel, radiating pestilence from her unwashed body. The fleas living in Isabella's undergarments were no ordinary parasites. They belonged to the species Xenopsilla chiopis, the oriental rat flea, carriers of the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the plague. These tiny creatures had found paradise in the warm, moist environment of Isabella's accumulated filth. They fed on her blood, bred in the folds of her clothing, and when she moved through her court, they jumped to new hosts with lethal efficiency. Isabella's daily routine became a circuit of death. Each morning she would attend Mass in the camp's chapel, surrounded by kneeling courtiers. The fleas would leap from her garments to theirs, carrying their microscopic cargo of doom. She would hold audiences in her tent, receiving reports from her commanders and diplomats, more opportunities for transmission. She would dine in the common hall, her presence an honor that soon became a death sentence. The plague's progression was swift and merciless. Contemporary accounts describe victims dying within 3 to 5 days of the first symptoms. Their bodies would be racked with fever so intense that witnesses claimed they could feel the heat radiating from dying men at a distance of several feet. The buboes, swollen lymph nodes filled with infected blood and pus, would grow until they burst, releasing a stench so foul that even hardened soldiers would vomit. By midsummer 1491, Isabella's court had become a death factory, and still no one suspected the truth, that their beloved queen, their symbol of Christian purity, was personally responsible for the carnage unfolding around her. August 1491. The heat is unbearable, and the smell emanating from Isabella's tent has become so overpowering that even her most devoted servants approach with herbs pressed to their noses. The Queen's shift, now black with months of accumulated filth, moves as if alive, crawling with the countless fleas that have made it their kingdom. The death toll is staggering. Of the 200 courtiers who accompanied Isabella to Santa Fe, fewer than 50 remain alive. The rest lie in hastily dug graves outside the camp, their bodies burned to prevent further contagion, but still no one connects their deaths to their queen. Isabella herself appears to be immune, her fanatical devotion seemingly protecting her from the disease ravaging her followers. She spends entire days in prayer, her voice hoarse from reciting Latin verses, her body swaying with religious ecstasy. The fleas crawl across her skin like living jewelry, and she welcomes them as instruments of divine testing. The Spanish military campaign begins to collapse. Commanders die faster than they can be replaced. Supply lines fail as merchants refuse to approach the plague-ridden camp. Messages to and from other Spanish cities are intercepted and burned, their carriers suspected of carrying contagion. Isabella's army, once 50,000 strong, shrinks daily as soldiers desert rather than face the mysterious pestilence consuming their leaders. Granada's Muslim defenders watch from their walls in amazement. They had prepared for siege warfare, starvation, bombardment, assault. They never expected their Christian enemies to simply die of disease. Rumors spread through the city that Allah himself was striking down the infidels, that their impending victory was divinely ordained. But it is Ferdinand, Isabella's husband, who finally begins to piece together the horrifying truth. Unlike his wife, he has maintained basic hygiene throughout the siege, washing his hands and changing his clothes regularly. This simple practice has kept him alive while his courtiers died around him. He notices that those who spend the most time in Isabella's presence die fastest, while those who maintain distance survive longer. On August 15th, the Feast of the Assumption, Ferdinand makes a terrible discovery. Entering Isabella's tent for their daily strategy meeting, he watches in horror as fleas leap from her clothing to his own. For the first time, he truly sees his wife, not as a holy queen, but as a walking plague vector, a biological weapon clothed in royal authority. That night, Ferdinand confronts Isabella with his suspicions. The scene, as recorded by court chroniclers, was apocalyptic. Isabella, her unwashed face gaunt with months of fasting and prayer, denied any connection between her vow and the plague. She claimed the deaths were God's will, a test of faith that only the truly devoted could pass. When Ferdinand suggested she break her vow and change her undergarments, she flew into a rage so violent that witnesses feared for the king's life. It was then that Isabella herself began to show the first symptoms, a slight fever, a swelling in her neck that she dismissed as a sign of divine favor. The queen, who had never changed her underwear, was finally succumbing to the plague she had been spreading for months. September 1491. Isabella lies dying in her tent, her body finally overwhelmed by the plague she had been incubating and spreading for nearly 5 months. The irony is complete. The queen who sought holiness through filth has been destroyed by her own devotion. But the damage she has wrought extends far beyond her own life. Spain itself teeters on the brink of collapse. With Isabella incapacitated and most of her court dead, the kingdom lacks effective leadership. The siege of Granada has become a disaster, with the Muslim defenders now considering a counter-offensive that could drive the Christians back across Castile. The Reconquista, 7 centuries in the making, faces total failure because of one woman's unwashed undergarments. Ferdinand, desperate to save both his wife and his kingdom, takes drastic action. On September 12th, while Isabella lies unconscious with fever, he orders her servants to strip away her plague-infested shift. The garment is so stiff with accumulated filth that it stands upright when removed, like armor made from human secretions. It is immediately burned, along with all the bedding and furnishings in Isabella's tent. The queen is bathed for the first time in 5 months, her body scrubbed with harsh soap and medicinal herbs. The water in the basin turns black with accumulated grime, and witnesses report that the smell was so overwhelming that several servants fainted. Fresh linen is brought from Cordoba, blessed by priests, and placed against Isabella's cleaned skin. Remarkably, impossibly, Isabella survives. Whether through divine intervention, natural immunity, or simply the removal of the plague source from her body, she recovers. But the Spain she awakens to is drastically changed. The human cost is staggering. Conservative estimates suggest that Isabella's plague killed over 3,000 people directly: courtiers, servants, soldiers, and civilians who came into contact with her court. But the indirect casualties number in the tens of thousands. Spanish military campaigns across Europe were crippled as experienced commanders died. Trade networks collapsed as merchants avoided Spanish cities. Entire noble families were wiped out, their bloodlines ended by contact with their queen. The political consequences were equally severe. Granada, sensing Christian weakness, began planning a general offensive that could have reversed centuries of Reconquista gains. Only Ferdinand's desperate diplomacy and the promise of massive tribute payments prevented total disaster. The siege that was supposed to end in glorious victory instead concluded with a negotiated surrender that left Granada's Muslim population largely intact. But perhaps the most profound impact was psychological. The Spanish court, that bastion of Christian supremacy, had been brought to its knees by the unwashed undergarments of its own queen. The survivors were traumatized, their faith in divine favor shaken. Many nobles abandoned court life entirely, retreating to their estates and refusing to participate in royal ceremonies. Isabella herself was changed by the experience. Though she publicly maintained that the plague was God's test, privately she was haunted by the knowledge that her religious devotion had nearly destroyed her kingdom. She never again made vows involving personal hygiene, and contemporary accounts suggest she bathed regularly for the rest of her life, a radical departure from medieval royal custom. The final terrible irony? Isabella's plague-spreading undergarments came closer to ending Christian rule in Spain than 700 years of Islamic resistance ever had. One woman's fanatical devotion to unwashed holiness nearly accomplished what the combined armies of Al-Andalus could not: the complete destruction of the Spanish kingdom. The fleas are long dead, the stained linen burned to ash, but the lesson remains. In the summer of 1491, the most powerful queen in Europe became a biological weapon, and her unwashed undergarments came within a heartbeat of rewriting history. Isabella may have conquered Granada, but she nearly lost Spain itself, all because she refused to change her clothes.